Shalom, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Did You Know? I'm your host, Rabbi Ira Brower from Shalom Boca Messianic Congregation here in Boca Raton, Florida.
I'm your co-host, Trysten Tice.
All right. So this morning, today we're going to be discussing something around the Apostle Paul, right?
Yes. And so we have a couple questions that are frequently asked questions about the life of Paul. But first, you want to give a little overview of who he even is?
Sure. So a lot of people don't realize that the person that we call Apostle Paul was Jewish. And not only was he Jewish, but he was a very devout rabbi, a very esteemed rabbi before he came to know Yeshua, know Jesus. And he definitely was never stopped being Jewish. And ironically was called to be a light to the Gentiles.
Yes.
Which to me always kind of reflects God's sense of humor in a way. That here's the most devout Jew, perhaps, that we read about in the New Testament. And you'd think, well, he would be going to the Jewish people. But no, God called him to go to these pagan Gentiles to share the love of the Jewish Messiah to them, to the people from the nations.
Yes. I love to. I was reading actually yesterday in Acts 26. If you're familiar with that passage, or people watching familiar with that, when he's before King Agrippa and he's giving his testimony, he was Jewish, very devout in his Judaism,
Right.
and had a radical encounter with Yeshua, and that's what led him to then be like, we can't reject him as the one God sent as a Messiah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just so ironic that when we first read about him in the book of Acts, he's participating in basically the murder of Stephen, the stoning of Stephen, and he's standing there holding the cloaks of the ones that were actually doing the dirty work.
Right.
Which gives an implication, not only was he in agreement with it, but he was like the organizer of it. And then we find him getting permission from the religious leaders to go up to Damascus to persecute and imprison other Jewish followers of Yeshua up in Damascus. And that's on the way up there is when he has that incredible encounter with Yeshua.
Right. And so the first question is, how do you view Paul's role as both a Pharisee and an apostle to the Gentiles in bridging Jewish and Gentile believers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So most people know that the Pharisees were the religious leaders in the first century, in Yeshua's time. And a lot of times they get a bad rap, right? Because they came against Yeshua. But really, in a lot of ways, the Pharisees they were in a lot of ways misapplying the Torah and God's word to keep the people oppressed. But in a lot of ways, they were devout people that were trying to do the right thing. And Paul, his Hebrew name is Shaul. By the way, as a side note, a lot of people maybe don't realize this, that his name wasn't changed to Paul. In Acts 13, verse 9, it says, Saul, who was also called Paul. In other words, he had both names, which is very common. For those of you that are Jewish, you probably have two names also. I have two names. My English name is Ira, but at birth I was given a Hebrew name. My Hebrew name is Yisrael.
Right.
And most Jewish people
Me too.
And you have a Hebrew name? What's your Hebrew name?
Frida.
Frida?
Yeah.
Okay. And so it's true for most Jewish people, except for those born in Israel, they would just have one Hebrew name. That would be their name, right?
Yeah.
It makes sense, right? Because Hebrew is the language. So Paul, having been born outside of Israel, his Hebrew name was Shaul, which is transliterated as Saul in the Bible. But his Greek name was Paul.
Okay.
So in the Greek world, he was known as Paul, but in Jewish circles, he would have been known as Shaul or Saul.
Got you.
Okay?
And so do you think that
So-
Paul helped to connect the Jews and the Gentiles?
So just to follow up to the question, and that is, so as a Pharisee, that was his thing, and he was very highly esteemed, and was persecuting the believers, had this encounter on the road to Damascus, on the way to persecute the believers, where Yeshua appears to him and calls him to be a light to the Gentiles.
Right.
So from that moment on, he's going to the Gentiles. But it's interesting, if you read the book of Acts, every place he went, every city in his journeys, he always went into the synagogue first to preach to his people, his own people, the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And he preached from the prophets, from the Hebrew scriptures to them to show how Yeshua fulfilled all of the prophecies of who the Messiah would be.
Okay.
Right? So in that sense, he did bridge a gap, but it was deeper than that in the sense that he understood God's priority, and evidence of that is Romans 1:16, right? I'm not
Yes.
ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first,
Yes. And then,
and then to the Gentile. Right? So he knew God's priority. Why? Because of the covenant that God made back with Abraham and through the old Hebrew
Right.
scriptures, to the Jew first, that Israel was to be a light to the nations, that Israel was to bring forth that knowledge of the one true God to all the nations. And so in Yeshua, that promise is fulfilled in the way that was meant to go out to the Gentiles as well. But Israel had to receive him first. And of course, many did, but the religious leaders are the ones that rejected this messiahship, his claim to be the Messiah.
right.
Right. So back to Apostle Paul, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So he went out and preached the gospel to the Gentiles, but he went to Israel first, to the Jewish people first.
Okay. So that did kind of bridge the gap between Jews and Gentiles in Paul because he's Jewish and also spoke to the Gentiles. He didn't not go to the Gentiles at all and only the Jewish people. He went to both.
Right, because God called him to go to the Gentiles.
Yes, but just the Jewish people first.
Right, always, yeah.
Okay. Second question. What is your perspective on Paul's writings about the Torah, particularly in passages like Romans 3:31, if we want to read that passage,
Yeah,
and Galatians 3:24?
yeah. So it's really important for people, students of the Bible, which all of us should be, right, as followers of Yeshua, to always know context, right?
Yes.
And when Paul wrote his letters, they were all written to primarily non-Jewish people.
Okay.
Okay? And so when he wrote to the non-Jewish people, in some cases they were confused about the role of the Torah. When we talk about the Torah, we're talking about the 5 books of Moses, right? That was given to Israel. And in some cases, there were Gentiles who took the law and made it a legalistic application.
Okay.
So Paul didn't abolish the law. In fact, in Romans, he talks about how the law is holy and just and good, talking about the Torah. But it's the misapplication of the Torah that he came against, oftentimes. In Galatians, in other parts of his letters. And that's really what it was. Because the whole Torah points to Yeshua. And so without the understanding of Yeshua being the epitome of Torah, the fulfillment of the Torah, then we miss the point of it altogether.
Right.
And I think that's what Paul's teaching was about in those passages.
Yes. Could we really quickly read Romans 3, verse 31?
Sure. Got it right here. It says, do we then nullify the Torah or the law through faithfulness? May it never be. On the contrary, we uphold the Torah.
Right.
Yeah. So again, oftentimes where people get confused is the misapplying what the Torah was meant to be. So it wasn't meant to be a list of rules of do's and don'ts, although it would seem that way, but it was meant to be a guideline for the people to live in right relationship with God in the context of that time, of Israel coming into the land.
Okay.
And of course, so much of the Torah is about the sacrifices. The different, the whole book of Leviticus is all about the sacrifices, and we don't do sacrifices now because Yeshua became the ultimate sacrifice.
Right.
And so, yet there's still value in understanding and studying those sacrifices and how they point to the ultimate sacrifice in Yeshua.
And so with that last thing, if we could give like a quick answer to this. And again, guys, this is, an overview of questions. And if you have a follow-up question or you feel like you want something better explained, please comment down below. We would be happy to dive into that further. But it says, Galatians 3:24, so the law was our guardian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Real brief, what is he saying there?
He's saying a similar type of thing. In other words, the Torah itself is incomplete. So it's just I don't want to say temporary because it's not done away with, but in a sense it was for a time until the greater revelation came in Messiah, the greater fulfillment. In other words, even the writer of Hebrews spends several chapters 9 and 10, talking about how the sacrificial system was a temporary system until the fullness of Messiah came. And after all, the temple's destroyed. When the temple was destroyed, there was a problem there for the rabbis, for those that didn't see Yeshua as that fulfillment. And so a new system was developed, which is based on works and not on faith.
Right. So the last question we'll answer is, how do you interpret Paul's statement in Romans 11 about the grafting in of Gentiles and the future of Israel?
Yeah. So again, oftentimes Paul is misinterpreted and falsely accused of teaching that the law was no longer valid, right? And there's a whole scenario in the book of Acts, maybe we can talk about another time, where he comes back to Jerusalem, and the apostles there were concerned for people, for the accusation that had been made against Paul, that he was teaching Jewish followers of Yeshua that they no longer had to keep the law of Moses, circumcise their sons, observe Shabbat, and so on. And they tell him to go take this vow and go into the temple to prove that there's nothing to these accusations. So Paul never taught that Jews that followed Yeshua were no longer, to follow Torah, follow the circumcision, the law, and so on. It's just that it wasn't the means of salvation.
Right.
It's part of who Israel was called to show forth God's faithfulness. And so the grafting in aspect is to show that Gentiles are grafted into that olive tree, who is Israel.
Yeah.
And not the other way around. And even though Israel was in unbelief, although there were always believers, Jewish believers in Yeshua, and of course today the Messianic movement is evidence of that. But even in Paul's day, there were many thousands and thousands of Jews who believed. But of course there were many who didn't believe, and those were the branches that were broken off.
Yeah.
But yet the wild branches were the Gentiles that were grafted into that tree. And what does that mean practically speaking? And maybe we can finish up with this part. And that is that Gentiles should understand that they, through grace, have been brought into a tree that is a Jewish tree, so to speak, right? It's the olive tree. It's Israel. The promise that God made to Israel. Now Gentiles get the benefit of that.
Yes. Guys, we hope that this helped to answer some of your questions. And again, super brief overview of some of these things and these concepts. But we would be happy to dive in deeper to answer further. So please comment things down below or other questions that arise. And I think we answered them as thoroughly as possible in the time.
Yeah.
We can.
Yeah, we would encourage you to post questions if you have questions related to this issue or anything related to Paul and his interaction with both Jews and Gentiles.
Or honestly, I'm thinking about it too. If you're Jewish watching this right now and you have points of contention with Paul or things that make you feel upset or like, well, Paul was, crazy and I've heard theories like Paul was on drugs, like some crazy things. So if you have contentions or things you want to talk through or comment, we welcome that as well. And we could address those too. Yeah. But yeah, like, comment, subscribe, share, and we will see you next week. Bye.